You remember last week we looked at the account of Adam and Eve in the garden. So they're in the garden and things go well until they don't. They ate, sin entered the world through their actions. And so God removes them from the garden. And as things move along, what we find is we make our way to Genesis chapter 12, and the blessing of God, purpose for humanity, rests on one man and his family. It's a man named Abram. Now, Abram has followed his father, and they've moved to this area, and he's been raised in Haran. And as he's there, it says in verse 1, and let's read through verse 4, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So we've got there this story of this man who is raised in an area, his family's all in this area, everything he's ever known, and then for whatever reason, we're not told, the blessing of God rests on him, and the plan and the providence of God is going to flow through him. So he's there with his wife, he's there with his extended family, and in the middle of everything he's ever known, and this Creator God speaks to him decisively, and what is the command? It's to go, and not just to go, like God goes to him and says, listen, I want you to move to Cincinnati. And you're like, Cincinnati, what's wrong with you? And he's like, no, he says, I want you to go. And what he tells him is, I want you to go, and I want you to go to a place that I'm going to show you. Y'all, it is like my worst nightmare to go on a road trip with no destination. Because when your kids say, how far yet? You're like, I don't know. None of us know. We're just driving forever until Siri says we're there. It's like a life of constant detour. And so he says, I want you to go. I want you to head to a place that you don't know. And I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a great nation. And so he looks and he's like, I count one. I count two. How are you going to make us a great nation? Sarah and I, we've been kicking it. We're doing okay. But it's just the two of us. And I'm 75 years old. And so God, it seems to me that if this was something that you had your heart, your heavenly heart set on, you probably should have started a little bit sooner. And we should have seen some fruit of this. By fruit, I mean children. And by children, I mean lots of them, because you're talking nations. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. In you, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. Through Abram and Sarah, everybody's going to receive the blessing of the Lord. Everyone's going to receive the blessing of the Lord. That's his commission. That's his word to them. That's his word of extension. That's the word of his blessing. But as we find and we follow the life of Abraham and Sarah, we'll find that it takes a full 25 years and a whole bunch of detours before they finally realize God's blessing. At some point, they're in this process, and they get this idea that maybe what God meant was that we need to show a little bit of ingenuity in helping his process along. So Sarah says, listen, I've got this handmaiden named Hagar. You should take her. She should become for you another wife. And so Abraham goes and he sleeps with her, and she has a child. That child's name is Ishmael. And so what they're trying to do is to engineer the promise of God and to engineer the blessing of God. So God does indeed bless this child, but this is not the child of the promise. And what we find when we get into Genesis chapter 21 is that finally the blessing of God through the plan and the purpose of God comes to fruition. Look at Genesis chapter 21. It says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time which God had spoken him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah had bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Abraham was, everybody say, 100 years young. He was 100 years young when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham and Sarah, nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So for 25 years, he waited on the promise. 25 years, God's taking him to a country that he's never been. God's making him a nation. God's seeking to make his own name great. He's seeking to bless people through Abraham. And here, finally, after 25 years, they give birth to a son. And so as he sees his son lying in his hands, this is the blessing, this is the promise. This is the blessing, this is the promise. This is what he's waited for 25 years for. This is what his now 100-year-old eyes have longed to see, the blessing and the fulfillment of God in his hands. If you've had children, you remember this feeling, this overwhelming feeling the first time you held your son or your daughter in your arms, and you had this sense, this capacity for love that you'd not known before. You'd love nieces, you'd love nephews, but you'd never held your child before, and as you hold them there, you have this amazing sense and this capacity for love in an area of your heart that hadn't been located before. This is Abraham. And for 25 years, he's had this, not a desire for children, but he's had the promise of God that he would, in fact, have children. And now he's experienced it. So for 25 years, he's waited. Now, between chapter 21 and chapter 22 picking up, scholars tell us there's somewhere between 15 to 20 years time difference, and the text doesn't give us this. But unless we have some sense of knowing in this understanding what it is to have waited for 25 years, what it is to have held the blessing, what it is to have held the promise, we can't understand the weight of the ask, the request and the command of God in chapter 22. Notice what he says. Chapter 22, it says, and after these things, God tested Abraham. It's so incredibly important that we catch this idea that this is a test. So Moses, as he's writing and recording this, gives us an insight that's not afforded to Abraham. And he gives us this insight so that we don't read these words in a way that would be scandalizing for us and scandalizing for our soul. So he said these words to test him. He said, Abraham, and Abraham responded, here I am. So he says, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall tell you. So think about this for a second. Abraham and Sarah, they wait for the child 25 years. There's a couple of detours, but they're there. They're holding their child, and now they watch him grow. They watch him learn. He's a father to this boy. So he's training him. He's equipping him. He's scolding him when he talks back to his mom. He's engaging him. He's teaching him to hunt. He's teaching him to fish. He's showing him how to tend livestock. He's showing him how to worship God. He's directing and corralling his heart to be a man of God. He loves this boy. In fact, we know that God knows of Abraham's love for him, because what does he say? He says, take your son, your only son, whom you love. There's no question that he loves the kid. So waited 25 years for him. Now he's watched him grow over 20 years. His heart being more tightly knit to Isaac, seeing in Isaac the plan, the providence, the purpose of God lived out. The blessing that's going to come to the nations is going through Isaac. He knows this. And so what he hears from God, he's familiar with. He knows what it is to offer a burnt offering as a sacrifice. This is what it is. You take lamb, you take a bull, you take a bird, and you cut it up into smaller pieces. You take it, you put it on the wood, and once it's on the wood, you set it ablaze. So this is what's going through his mind. You want me to take his life and to let his body be burned for you. Let the gravity of that sit. Now, Moses, as he's writing this, speeds right past it, but we hear these words, and it seems to us grotesque. This is why Moses began this section saying this was a test to reveal Abraham's heart. There comes a moment over the course of our lives when we view the things God has given us as best. And when we face the call of God and we're asked to consider, are we willing to relinquish the gift in order to worship the giver? That begins to reveal our heart's dedication to the Lord. Look at how Abraham continues to respond. He says, give me your son, your only son, the son in whom you love, and offer him to me as a burnt sacrifice before me. So the text opens up in verse 3. It says, so Abraham rose early in the morning. He saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut wood for a burnt offering, and he arose, and he went to the place which the Lord God had told him. So this is what he does. The text, Moses gives us no insight. It doesn't say, and Abraham didn't slink a wink that night, and he's having these long discussions with Sarah. She's saying, did God really say this? Oh, I just don't know Abraham. And he's up, and he's pleading with God, and he's just sweating, and he's crying, and he's standing over his boy in his bed saying, I can't do this. I just don't know how I'm going to do this. We're not given any of those insights. Nothing of his internal state is spoken. Moses is giving us these inane details, these things that seem almost senseless given the depiction of what needs to take place. He woke up, he got up early, he saddled his donkey, he grabbed these 2 guys, and then he gathered the wood. Something of this seems to be communicating to us that Abraham is going through these things, and he's running through all of this stuff and putting it together. And one of the commentators said that he's even doing things in a sense that the order does not compute. So what would have made the most sense is for him to wake up, for him to gather his men together and say, hey, let's go out and gather the wood. And they've got all that together. And then he saddles the donkey, and then he puts the wood upon it, and then they head out. But notice that the order there, he saddles the donkey way before he's ever ready to leave. And so there's something of his sense of he is struggling with this. And he doesn't get to struggle with this over just like a 2 or 3 hour excursion. If somebody lives in Radcliffe and all of a sudden they come and they say, listen, I've got to walk down to Hodgenville, and when I get there, I've got a hard thing I've got to do. And so they head out and they start walking, and then several hours later, they're like, oh, I'm here. What's going on? You see, for Abraham, for 3 days, he experienced that every step he took was a step closer to him having to honor the command of the Lord. It's difficult for him to rise up early, to get everything ready, and to head out. But what I want you to see is that every step he took towards the Mount of Moriah is a step closer to the end of his son's life. He waited for 25 years for the boy to be born. The child is born, and now he's lived for 20 years with his son. And every step he takes is a step he gets closer to the end of his son's life. And on this trip, it's nighttime, they go to sleep. He sleeps beside his son. And as he watches his son sleep, he sees his chest rise and fall. He knows that every breath he's taking is one breath closer to his last. It's one breath closer to him having to sacrifice his son. So they get closer and closer to the mount. And on the 3rd day, verse 4 says, the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and he saw that place from afar. So Abraham says to the young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy, we will go over there and worship. And notice what he says here, and come again to you. there is something in the heart of Abraham that clings to hope. There's something in the heart of Abraham, in his knowledge of God, in his goodness, in his steadfast promise that clings to hope. Even as he knows that to fulfill the word of the Lord, to fulfill the command of the Lord, is to walk up the mountain and to sacrifice his son, there is something that clings to hope that says, surely my son and I will come to you again. This is what it is to be caught in the promise of God and to face the difficulties of our lives. We face hardship and suffering. We know something of God's goodness, we know something of God's promise, but yet the realities of our difficulties and our afflictions and the afflictions of those near us call into question, do we believe what his word says? Or do we believe it is more true in the difficulties of our experience? Abraham clings to the hope and the promise of God. And so they get there, and in verse 6 picks up and says, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took his hand, the fire and the knife, so they went, the both of them, together. And so he leaves these servants, and Abraham goes over and he unburdens the donkey, and he takes all the wood, and he places it on the back of his son. His son made to carry the instrument in some sense of his own sacrifice. And Abraham, in his hands, he has the fire, he has the knife. The two of them head up, and you can almost have a sense of this. They're walking up the mountain. Isaac is feeling the burden of this. He has the weight of all of this wood on his back. And so every step they take, they gain a little bit of altitude. The air gets a little bit thinner. They gain a little bit more altitude. The air gets a little bit thinner. Isaac goes over to his father, and he has a sense, because he feels the weight of the wood. I know I have the fuel for the fire. I know my father has the instrument of the fire, and my father has the instrument of death. But it occurs in his mind, the question that's been rolling around for 3 days, where is the sacrifice? We get the sense that Isaac has been allowing this question to permeate, to roll around in his mind and in his heart. He says to his father, my father. He says, here I am, my son. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Dad, I know we've got everything we need. I know we're fully equipped and we're headed up there, and I know what we're going to do. Hey, Dad, where's the lamb? Where's the one who has to die? Where's the one that will lose their life? Abraham responds, he says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. When God spoke to Abram and he told him to go out, he used this word son over and over and over again. He says, take your son, your only son, the son whom you love. So it's not lost on us that when Abraham was responding to his boy, when he's responding to the promise, when he's responding to the blessing, when he's responding to the one all his hopes rest in, all the hopes of humanity rest in, when he's responding to this one who asks him, Dad, where's the lamb? Where's the one we're going to sacrifice? He says, God will provide the lamb for his offering, my son. The weight, the difficulty, the pain. Hope clinging to fear. Trusting in the plan and the providence of God. Verse 9 says, when they came to the place which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. I just want you to think about this for a second. Abraham is 100 years old. And as a 100-year-old man, he's made a 3-day journey, which finds its culmination in climbing a mountain, right? We have no indication that he's competed in any number of Ironman events. We have no indication that he is an ultra-marathon runner. All we know of him is that he is a 100-year-old man who has managed to make a 3-day pilgrimage and to hike up a mountain. It is not beyond the realm of possibilities to suggest that he is a mite tired. I just want you to see him as a centenarian. I want you to see him as a 100-year-old man. And on the other side of the spectrum, we see Isaac. Let's just say he's somewhere between 12 and 20. It's a 3-day walk. It's an idle walk. Abraham's 100 years old. It's not a sprint. It's not a 3-day run. He's strong enough that he's able to take the wood on his back to climb up the mountain. And so when it comes to this point of having to bind him and having to put him on top of the wood, is there any room in your mind to believe that Abraham is like, oh, I got you. Like, is he corralling him? If he goes to Isaac and says, listen here, Isaac, I'm going to take you, I'm going to bind you, I'm going to put you on the wood, and I'm going to sacrifice you to God. If in that moment Isaac says, oh man, catch me. Abraham's like, my hip, come back. Like, it's not happening. It's just not happening. It's comical to suggest that Abraham's up there. He's like, all right, hold on. Oh, I got you. Oh, no. It takes something of the submission of the son to engage in the sacrifice. So there's Isaac. He also knows he's the blessing. He also knows he's the promise. He knows that through him and through his line come the blessing for all humanity. But he willingly lays down. He allows himself to be bound. And so there he is, bound on the wood. Every breath he takes, he knows something of the promise of God. But he's beginning to wonder about the plan of God. Because in front of him is pain. And in front of him is death. And the text tells us, as he lies there bound, Abraham reaches his hand, and in it he takes the blade. And he picks it up, and he prepares to slay his son. And as the knife is hanging in the air, he hears his name. The text tells us that the angel of the Lord said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He says, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that the fear of God is in you, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and he looked, and behold, behind him there was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and he took the ram and he offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. You see, there was something of Abraham clinging to God and who he knew God to be. And God had sent Abraham on this mission for the express purpose of revealing where Abraham's heart was before God. The author of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 11, and verses 17 through 19, gives us insight into what Abraham was thinking and what he was believing about God. He says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in fact in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And he considered that God was able even to raise him up from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham believed in his heart that God had called him to sacrifice his son. So as he drew back the knife and he prepared to take his son's life, what he was believing in that moment is that that was what God was calling him to do. And that even when he fulfilled the command of God, that God would stand by his word. And that God would bring back his son from the dead. You see, in that moment, as Abraham stood there ready to take his son's life, what Abraham demonstrated that he was ready to be known as a worshiper of the giver, not merely one who chose to worship the gift. So we consider, what does it look like for you to exercise your faith in worshiping the giver instead of worshiping the gift? When you consider your life laid out before God, what it looks like for you to be one who is faithful to God. Consider God calling you to something that when you consider it, there's something of uncertainty in it. There's something for which you don't know how it's going to plan out. You don't know what it looks like for you to make this change in jobs. You don't know what it looks like for you to make this change of location. You don't know what it looks like for you to end this relationship. You don't know what it looks like for you to head down this next path. So there's something of uncertainty in it. There's a sense of it being unsafe. Generally speaking, we're people who like things planned out. We like things that are safe. We like things that are steadfast. And I like to know that when I place my left foot down, that it's going to be received, that the ground is going to hold me up. But could it be that in our quest for safety, that we are those who no longer are willing to head out to go to the place that we don't know, to do the thing that we don't know fully the cost of what it's going to take us? So in the uncertainties of life, in the unsafety of life, in those things that are uncertain, perhaps what God is calling you to do is to exercise a relinquishing of control. Perhaps what God is asking you to do is to sacrifice the control that you desperately want to hold on to. Or it could be, as Jesus wrote to the disciples, or said to the disciples rather, in Luke 14, 26 and 27, he says, if anyone wants to come to me but does not hate his own father or mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his mother-in-law, wait, hold on. Yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross cannot come after me. Whoever doesn't bear his own cross cannot come after me and be my disciple. So Jesus, in talking about our families and Scripture, gives a whole host of information and direction that you're to honor your father and your mother. And the one that doesn't care for his own family is worse than an unbeliever. But yet Jesus, when he's speaking about what it is to love our father and our mother and our children and our sisters and our brothers, he says our love for them must seem as hate in comparison to our love for God. So when people hear you speak of the Lord, when people see the way you engage God, when people hear that you're a Christian, does it compute to them that your love for God is so incredibly over-encompassing, so immense, so amazing, so inspiring, that they consider that your love for your family is tantamount to hate? I would say that most of us, our love for family is highest. Our willingness to sacrifice for family is highest. If you're a parent, think about the time you spend serving your children. If you have multiple children, they're in any type of sports or extracurriculars, you are a taxi driver. You could retire young if you could somehow figure out how to charge the government and become an uber sanctified worker for them. This is not a bad idea. Any congressman in the House, could we pass this? I'd probably go Lyft instead of Uber. That's just a preference, though. We sacrifice for our kids. We sacrifice for the things that we want in life. We sacrifice to retire young. We sacrifice to have a nice house. We sacrifice to take lovely vacations. We sacrifice for experiences. We sacrifice so that our kids don't have to sacrifice. But could it be that God is calling you and asking you to sacrifice something? Probably you look at the example of Abraham and Isaac and you think, this is extreme. God would never call me to sacrifice these things. So even to the idea of sacrifice, you've kind of checked it back there. And sacrifice for you is giving up processed wheat for Lent. Sacrifice for you is giving up something that's not such a big deal. You're drinking half-calf coffee as you approach this thing. I'm only half caffeinated. Yeah, but like your intake is quadrupled. Like the math doesn't compute. And you have like caffeine patches up your arm. You're not fooling anybody. What would it look like for you? What would it look like for us to be a people who are willing to sacrifice for the goodness of God? What would it look like if we were the people of God where he says, listen, I don't want sacrifice. I'm not interested in your burnt offerings, but we were the people of God who give our whole heart to him, that giving our whole heart to him, our hearts would reveal that he is where our treasure is. Matthew 6:21 says that where our treasure is, there our heart is also. I guess I'm just asking the question, is our heart aligned with God? In aligning and giving and yielding our hearts to him, are we willing to trust him in the difficult things he calls us to? As he leads us in places that aren't safe. As he leads you to submit and following him in decisions that are anything but certain. He reveals himself to be good. It could be that you're here in this place and you've been wrestling, you've been wrangling, or maybe you've been wholly indifferent to the whole idea that God is calling you to something. We heard at the beginning of the service of what it looked like to turn away from who we were, to turn towards Jesus. You see, the first step of obedience and trusting God that he wants from any of us is a life submitted to him. God gave his son. You see, God didn't withhold the greatest thing that he had. He gave his son that his son might die for you. The Bible tells us that the wages of sin is death. So what you and I get over living our lives, good, bad, or indifferent, is deserving death and forever separation from God. In order to answer for this and in order to make us holy and pure and righteous before God, he gave his son to be born and to live a perfectly sinless life and then to die, taking the penalty and the punishment for your sin and mine. Y'all would check this out. The great news in this is Jesus, the Son of God, this is what he said of himself. No one takes my life from me. But like Isaac, he willingly laid it down. But unlike Abraham and Isaac, the hand of God was not stayed. Jesus died for you. He laid down and surrendered his life for you. He took upon the separation of God for you. Isaac, in the moments before he thought his life would end, as he lay there breathing and he saw his father's hand pulled back, heard the words that set him free. Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on your son. But as Jesus hung on the cross and he experienced the wrath of God and the anguish and the pain and the torment, there was no release for him. Instead, it was Jesus who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he breathed his last so that you might be set free, so that you might be able to trust and follow and worship the one who gives the best gifts of all.